here's a surprising and even a shocking claim from early Buddhism. Can affection become a problem? This is something I want to get into in today's video. So nowadays, if you go to your normal Dharma teacher, many Dharma teachers emphasize the practices involved in kindness, in love, in affection, loving kindness practice in particular. And that is a great thing. Most of us need practice in loving kindness. We need to boost our ability to be kind to one another, to be compassionate, and so on. I've done many, many videos on that topic in the past. Nevertheless, there's a subtle potential drawback here. It's one that is involved with the whole idea of loving kindness, but of making a mistake in what loving kindness really is, in the true practice of loving kindness. And that is the subject of today's video. Now, recently I did another video on an early poem called the Poem of the Rhinoceros, the Sutta on the Rhinoceros, and in that poem the Buddha extols the solitary life, the life that is led more or less alone. Now, some people think of that as kind of a one-off poem, that the Buddha was only said that kind of thing in that one place, but that's not so. Elsewhere, the Buddha made very similar kinds of claims. For example, in the Greater Sutta on Emptiness, the Buddha says, "A mendicant doesn't shine who enjoys company in groups, who loves them and likes to enjoy them." That is, the monastic who, or indeed the person who wants to enjoy company with lots of people, wants to spend time in large groups, potentially with sort of affectionate kinds of interactions with one another, that person is going to find difficulty achieving truly deep meditative states, and indeed, eventually, according to the Buddha, is going to have trouble attaining enlightenment. True practice towards enlightenment requires seclusion, requires renunciation of such kinds of pleasures. And this problem is heightened when we turn from the monastic life to the lay life that most of us live. For example, in this poem to the Rhinoceros, the Buddha talks about the difficulties of having a family. In that, he says, in the first stanzas of that poem, he says, "When you've laid down arms towards all creatures, not harming even a single one, don't wish for a child, let alone a companion. Wander alone like a rhino. Those with close relationships have affection, following which this pain arises. Seeing this danger born of affection, wander alone like a rhino. Seeing this danger born of affection, wander alone like a rhino." So here the Buddha is directly saying that there are dangers from affection, that affection itself can be dangerous depending on how we hold it. Elsewhere, the Buddha makes very much the same points. There's a sutta where the Buddha is at Savatthi, and he's approached by the elderly Visakha. She is an elderly woman, and she is in mourning because one of her granddaughters has recently passed away. And the Buddha asks her, "Visakha, would you like to have as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Savatthi?" And she says, "Of course, Buddha, I would love to have as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Savatthi." And the Buddha says, "Well, Visakha, how many people a day pass away in Savatthi?" And she remarks that at least one person passes away every day in Savatthi, and perhaps as many as 10 people a day. And then the Buddha points out, in that case, Visakha, you would be in mourning every day of your life. He says, "Those who have 100 loved ones, Visakha, have 100 sufferings. All the sorrows and lamentations and the countless forms of suffering in the world occur because of those that we love. Without loved ones, they do not occur. That's why those who have no loved ones at all in the world are happy and free of grief. So aspiring to the sorrowless and stainless, have no loved ones in the world at all. This is a very surprising recommendation, perhaps even, we might say, a shocking recommendation. Have no loved ones at all. Some people react really with surprise at this claim of the Buddha's, and I understand why, but at the same time, I can also see why the Buddha says this. We have to remember that the Buddha himself left the family life. That was what got him out of the palace in the first place, wandering to find enlightenment. And elsewhere in many suttas, the Buddha makes very much the same point, that children can bring suffering, that rejecting or going beyond the family life, leaving it behind, is a life with less chance of suffering in it. That is, that familial love and attachment bring suffering basically like nothing else can. That's the point that he's making here. Elsewhere, the Buddha points out that this kind of affection can engender hatred. For example, the Buddha talks about how if we have somebody towards whom we're very affectionate, perhaps a family member or a close friend, and we note that there's somebody else who is ill-disposed towards our family member or friend, we can in turn engender hatred towards them because they don't like the person towards whom we're affectionate. That's one way that affection can engender hatred. The Buddha also talks about how hatred can engender affection. For example, we have the very famous expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if there's somebody towards whom we have hatred, and there's somebody else who hates them as well, we may decide that person, we may feel affection towards that other person in virtue of their hatred towards the person that we hate. Now, perhaps that's somewhat better than having hatred towards them, but clearly we can see that this whole situation is less than really healthy. Further, we can begin to see here how ordinary affection is, in fact, somewhat closely related to hatred. Bound up in ordinary affection is this mentality of us and them. Our people, the people towards whom we're affectionate, and them, the other people, the people who perhaps don't hold those that we're affectionate towards in good light. And so we think of them as people that we don't like, people towards whom we're not affectionate, people perhaps towards whom we have hatred. In another sutta, the Buddha points out several potential drawbacks to having affection towards another person in the Sangha. That is to say, even affection in a monastic context can be problematic. He notes that if there's somebody towards whom we're affectionate, and that other person is perhaps sanctioned by the Sangha, or leaves the Sangha, disrobes, or moves away, or dies, we may decide ourselves to disrobe and leave the Sangha and leave Buddhist practice behind. In that way, this kind of affection reveals the implicit sort of identification that goes on with our affection. We become identified with the object of our affection, this other monastic in this particular case, so that when they, let's say, become sanctioned by the Sangha, it affects us. We feel let down by that in some way. We decide perhaps to leave the Sangha because we're so annoyed by the whole thing. Or if they leave, then we leave because we're no longer attached to the Sangha anymore. We were simply attached to them. And this reveals, I think, how ordinary forms of affection are bound up in attachment. And so even if we don't necessarily follow the Buddha all the way on all of his recommendations that I've been giving in this video, those of us who are lay people may say they love their families and they wouldn't abandon them for the world. Nevertheless, I think we may be able to see the point that the Buddha is making, that attachment here is bound up in that affection, that identification is bound up in that affection, that our ordinary tendency towards affection is ego-driven to an extent. Not necessarily entirely, but at least to an extent. And this is one of the ways that our ordinary affection is different in a very deep way, different from the loving kindness that we ordinarily practice in a Buddhist context. Because true loving kindness is, or at least is supposed to be, egoless and boundless. It's not bound up in our own attachments and identifications. It extends towards all beings and all creatures. And there's a very important a stanza in the Sutta on loving kindness that makes this clear in I think, a very powerful way by associating it with our ordinary tendency towards affection towards family members, but then extended outwards in a boundless and egoless way. That stanza goes, "Even as a mother would protect with her life her child, her only child, so too for all creatures unfold a boundless heart." Now, recently there has been the scholarly suggestion that loving kindness, the practice of loving kindness itself, might be liberative. That is, it might lead us directly to enlightenment. I did a video about that claim a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you want to hear more about that subject. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the channel. It's linked down below and up here on the screen. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.